Hi, I think we're good to go.
Cool. I'll begin my speech in three, two, one. Panel, we think so that the world of these workers on side opposition is far worse off on a comparative to what their world look like on our side of the house. At a point in time, we go ahead and support gamification in general within workspace to begin with, right? Why are workers' life in the workplace not good without gamification in general, right? One, we think so that a lot of people have no alternative for work in general to begin with. That essentially looks like people lack financial resources to start business. Thereby, a lot of people have to go ahead and opt into like corporate world, etc., etc. But second, they don't have generational wealth so that they can go ahead and support their family in general to begin with. But third, they essentially have to go ahead and support their like families financially. Thereby, they have to take the burden of going ahead and working into corporate life, wherein they don't have to have incur much risk and there's some sort of stability in general to begin with. At that point in time, we think that entering the workplace is like a default for a larger number of people within status quo in general to begin with, right? Why is that necessarily true, right? We think so that capitalist society encourages you to enter the workplace in general to begin with. But second, you essentially have to go ahead and give out some sort of financial support to your family, but also have financial independence at large in general to begin with. But third, we think so that societal conditioning at large becomes that this should be your end goal. There are a lot of people are like coerced in general to enter into the corporate world in general to begin with. But second, in terms of discipline and regularity, right? We think so that like workplace in general is a formal area. At that point in time, you necessarily have to go ahead and abide by the norms that are set by the corporate in general to begin with. Thereby, you essentially have to go ahead and do the routine work again and again in general to begin with. That essentially looks like you have to go ahead and comply by the 9 to 5 policy and essentially have to go ahead and work within the stipulated time period that is given to you. You have to go ahead and have like you can only have lunchtime at a specific period of time. You essentially have to go ahead and abide by the formal code of conduct that is given in terms of wearing similar kind of clothes, only wear formal clothes in a lot of offices. You have to go ahead and continue the mundane tasks that you are given in terms of the job profiles that you essentially have. If you are a market researcher, you essentially have to go ahead and do the research again and again in general to begin with, right? But third, we think so that a lot of people lack some sort of freedom within these workplaces in general to begin with because of the hierarchies that necessarily exist, right? At a point in time, there's really strong and strict hierarchies within the corporate space. The organizations are necessarily so big at that point in time, the decision-making power is divided and limited to the people in general to begin with. At that point in time, we don't think so that individuals necessarily have a lot of freedom in terms of going ahead and like breaking the chain of command, also going ahead and giving out these kind of like incentives in terms of going ahead and giving out ideas to people in general to begin with. But fourth, in terms of tiredness, right? We think so that a constant tiredness for a lot of people in general to begin with, because you necessarily have to go ahead and travel a lot in terms of going to your offices, and that like takes up a lot of your time. If you are working from home, that also like leads to a lot of tiredness, primarily because you have to go ahead and sit into one place in general to begin with. Therefore, that what we go ahead and conclude is that it's a pretty hard thing, and it's a pretty hard place to be in general, primarily because of all these reasons. It leads to individuals have a lot of pressure and anxiety and tiredness in general to be done, which is necessarily important for these individuals to go ahead and like go ahead and have that sort of self-actualization to the extent that they're able to go ahead and have their productivity in general to begin with. How are coping with their day-to-day much better on our side of the house to begin with? One, in terms of sense of competition, right? I think so that the sense of competition is a good thing for a larger number of individuals in general to begin with, because human beings are designed that way. They necessarily need an external motivation factor to go ahead and work the best that they can essentially go ahead and do, and that is something which can lead to increase in productivity in general to begin with. Intuition for me, at a point in time, I'm right now in a high competing debating, necessarily have the going ahead and giving out my best performance. Thereby, my productivity is by virtue has to go ahead and increase in terms of human beings are structured. But second, in terms of accomplishment, right? We think so that in terms of day-to-day scenarios, individuals do not get that sort of sense of accomplishment in general, especially if you are into corporate structure. Don't get that sort of sense of accomplishment. At that point in time, when you have an incentive to go ahead and do better, but also you have an incentive to go ahead and garner some sort of like some sort of benefit in terms of you getting an award, etc., etc. We think so that sense of accomplishment necessarily leads people to go ahead and do better in general. But third, in terms of validation, right? At a point in time, there's gamification within workplace that essentially also looks like going ahead and avoiding best idea that necessarily comes up, or also going ahead and giving value to the ideas that people essentially go ahead and give. At that point in time, we think so that individuals largely get a lot of validation in general. We think so that workplace also gets better, primarily because you go ahead and hear ideas from different people and you go ahead and value those ideas in general, which is not happening on that side of the house. At a point in time, you have to go ahead and strictly follow a chain of command, and you essentially can't go ahead and be credited for the that has been given to you in general to begin with. You also always have like this credit given to your bosses in general to live. Before we think so that even if you are not at the top of the ladder, that gives you like some sort of inspiration to go ahead and do better again and again. At that point in time, you have something to look forward to, and this is something which is an added incentive for you to go ahead and do better within space and increase your productivity in general to begin with, and also improve your performance as an individual in general, right? But what is Orb going to go ahead and say? They might go ahead and run that, oh, it leads to hustle culture. People would want this, thereby they are like have greater incentive to outcompete other people in general to begin with. Why would that necessarily not happen, right? 4 reasons. One, we think so that rest is likely to be seen as conducive to productivity, right? At that point in time, if you know that productivity will give you a medal, you are going to go ahead and see rest as an important thing to go ahead and achieve that productivity in general to begin with. But second, we think so that gamification is not the cause of hustle culture in general to begin with. Primarily, the narratives of hustle culture exist regardless on their side of the house as well, right? Why is that necessarily true? 3 reasons. One, we think so that gamification is a recent addition that has necessarily happened, and the hustle culture exists since past. But second, even without gamification, bosses force you to go ahead and work in general to begin with. But third, in terms of unemployment, at a point in time, there is large unemployment. It is difficult to go ahead and call out the bosses in general, primarily because they have greater power over you before that POI closing.
If hustle culture exists anyway, bosses have an incentive to inspire you and make you work anyway. What is the comparative? Tell us what specifically gamification does, rather than just complaining about how no productivity is bad.
Cool. I think so that at a point in time, you have gamification as an intrinsic individual, as a person working within that hustle culture. You get get a value in terms of going ahead and getting additional motivation, but also getting additional cathartic value at a point in time. You go ahead and see that you have achieved something in a short span of time. At a primarily because promotion can't be guaranteed in a month or so. At that point in time, your sense of achievement is something which is much better off on our side of the house. It doesn't look like that you are going ahead and dragging your assets for nothing in general to begin with, and the only credit is giving to your bosses. You see that some credit is given for the work that you essentially do on our side of the house to begin with, right? But thirdly, in terms of like different wage system, right? Even before gamification exists, you essentially had to go ahead and give like money to the people who do more work in general to begin with. The hustle culture is something which is symmetric on either sides of the house to begin with. At that point in time, gamification uniquely allows the person to go ahead and cope up with the stress and the hard work that they essentially put in, and also give them the reward for the hard work that they essentially put in general to begin with, right? At that point in time, so that individuals become much more happy and confident on our side of the house to begin with. At a point in time, they have much more motivation and presence of mind on our side of the house, right? Like opposition essentially cannot go ahead and prove to you that hustle culture suddenly disappears, or this is something, our world is filled with hustle culture in general to begin with. We think so on our side of the house is much better, primarily because individuals have something to live up to within that sort of terrible place that is essentially working in. At that point in time, we think so that the benefit marginally accrues on our side of the house, but also those individuals are able to go ahead and have any sort of cathartic value, but any sort of reward for the work that they essentially do. Because of all those reasons, very proud to be.
Good. I thank the speaker for that fine speech, calling upon the leader of opposition. Whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Hi, am I audible?
Perfectly audible.
Thank you. Apparently my Wi-Fi is choppy today, so if I cut off, if someone can let me know, that would be appreciated. So, hi, I'm Nasa. I'll be the leader of opposition, pronounced she, they. Kotaro will be going second, pronounced he, they. I prefer POIs in the chat. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things from me. Firstly, on setups. Secondly, why it's worse for workers, both on the level of exploitation and on the level of meaning of work. And thirdly, why it's worse for the productivity of corporations taking their best case and why it's still bad, right? So firstly, on setup, 3 things. Firstly, what does this look like? 3 things to talk about here. Firstly, this means that people are valued on the output that they're able to make and the hours that they're able to put in. For example, if you go have more hours, you're going to be on the top of the leaderboard. For example, if you make more money and bring in more clients, you're going to be at the top of the leaderboard. Secondly, this is likely to be something that resets and is going to be changing over time, meaning that if you're able to get on the top of the leaderboard for this week, this doesn't mean that you're going to be on the top of the leader for next week, and this is going to be constantly like repeated and resetted so that these people still have the motivation to work on the next week, for example, right? But thirdly, we would say this necessarily means that for example, the promotions that you're able to get, the kind of salaries that you're going to have from this company is going to be dependent on the kind of results that you're able to get through this game, and therefore this is going to be largely changing into the circumstances of the people that they're able to get throughout this corporation is going to be dependent on the game that they play. Why is this likely to be the characterization? The main reason here is that because the company wants wants productivity of its workers, it's going to maximize the amount of productivity that they're able to get from this gamification. And therefore, it's likely to be something that's mostly exploitative, right? For the reason that one, they want to create incentive for these people to continue to work. And therefore, they're likely to do things like reset these leaderboards very often so that people now want to get at the top of the leaderboard again. For example, they want to make these people feel as if their financial spending is now dependent on this leaderboard. I mean, making them want to work harder, for example, right? The second main reason here is that the company's capacity to be able to monitor these people is limited. Therefore, they aren't able to, like, for example, determine how much money this person brings into the company. They're likely to use quantifiable measures to be able to measure these, like, the productivity of these people. For example, they're going to like think about how many hours they put in rather than the amount of money that they've made for the company, because these things are impossible to determine. And therefore, this is likely to be the metric in which this is used to determine the productivity of these individuals. Second main space of setup, we would say that people on the comparative, people are likely to work on the basis of the motivation that they have. For example, if someone wants like a promotion, they're likely to work harder because they want that promotion. Some people choose not to work hard for the reason that they don't want that promotion or they don't care about work as much. This problem here is that this forces all individuals to work, regardless of whether they actually really want to do well in the job, which we think is really bad, right? But thirdly, we would say as like a kind of preemption against what closing government might say, we see the criteria to determine this like is unlikely to be something that is like largely, for example, objective and prefers people like minorities. We would say that, for example, especially for like women, it's going to be very difficult to get at the top of this leaderboard because you have to put in so many hours. For example, you're unable to take things like maternity leave. And all these structural problems are going to exist on either side house. It's severely unclear that we don't think that this is going to be beneficial to minorities or beneficial in an objective sense. We say this because the criteria is set by the people at the top of the company. This isn't going to change regardless. So moving on to my first argument. So why is it going to be worse for workers and it's going to be exploitative? We understand that opening government says that there's already a hustle culture. We think the unique delta comes in three ways. The first unique thing that this gamification does is it makes people get into the mentality of competition, which uniquely happens because these people themselves buy into this narrative of mentality and buy into the addictive mechanism that gamification prevents, right? This means that firstly, because this feeds into the instinct of these people to want to get these rewards, for example, because they prioritize the short-term like validation that OG wants to present, for example, the kind of like, being on the top of the leaderboards and being like, admired by other people. All this kind of mechanism feeds into the instincts of the people so that they keep working hard. We think this is the same thing that games do so that people keep coming back to their games. These corporations are now able to utilize this mechanism to make people feel that they have to keep competing and feel that they have to keep working hard. But secondly, the mechanism here is very important that it gets constantly updating, meaning that even if you work hard once, it's not enough. And you have to work hard next week as well, that you're able to keep being at the top of the leaderboard. Once you get this validation, because you don't want to lose it, you are constantly pushed to keep working hard every week and every year, right? But secondly, we say this because the financial stability is now dependent on this gamification, meaning that people are obviously pushed hard, right? The first reason is because this is likely to become a metric to determine how much you get paid. And therefore, people are likely to feel as if they have to keep working hard so that they do get paid because they don't want to lose money and not be able to support their family, for example. But secondly, even if this gamification isn't directly leading to their money, they're likely to feel as if they're going to lose money at the point in which they come at the bottom of the leaderboard, because they obviously know that this now means that the corporation now sees them as unproductive, and therefore, even if Gov is able to prove that this is directly related to the kind of money that they're able to get, these people are likely to feel that it's dependent on the financial stability that they're able to get, and therefore this is likely to push them really hard. This is very different because even if the company itself is exploitative, we uniquely prove to you why these individuals now feel the pressure to have to work hard, which pushes these workers off the edge, right? But thirdly, we would say a collective action problem now severely exists because you have competition among workers, and now basically you yourself have to keep working hard because you know that the other person might also work hard. And therefore, the speculation leads to people working hard. So what are the impacts of this? Mainly four things. Firstly, people are simply going to overwork themselves. It's awful because you have your mental health compromised, your health is compromised. You might not be able to work hard in the future because you burn out. Government says that productivity is important. It's really unclear why. Obviously, this harm is outweighing that, right? But secondly, even if they do not work hard and there are, for example, regulations put in place, the fact that these people constantly feel as if they're not doing enough or that they have to do more in and of itself is a harm because they constantly feel as if they have to keep being productive, right? Thirdly, we would say people are not going to be able to be financially stable at the point in which many times the salary might like fluctuate according to the kind of productivity that you're able to make. For example, this means that you're not able to have enough money to put food on the table sometimes. This income becomes unstable, meaning that you cannot plan out your future because you don't know how much money you'll be able to make the next year because you do not know how much productivity you'll be able to make. This in and of itself is a harm at the point in which these people are unable to get financially stable from this job, right? Fourthly, we'd say it becomes you create far worse workplaces in which people are unable to call out things like exploitation or call out things like, for example, sexual harassment, that which they're in a competition with other people because this mechanism mechanism of collective action exists, you're unlikely to want to call out the company and like to abide by what the company says far more because of this mechanism of competition. Therefore, you get far worse workplaces where you cannot do things like call out, right? Thirdly, why is the meaning of work likely to be lost for many people? I want to flag out here that opening government says that it's good that because you get validation. The problem here is that one, not people are going to get this validation because only few people can win this competition. But secondly, this isn't like to be a sustainable source of validation at the point in which you lose it the next week. The problem here is that we support on our side that people are able to get meaning from the work that they actually do. This is marginally reduced. This is like really, really reduced on their side. The point in which one, there's a structure to change things that firstly, because now the people around you praise you at the point in which you do things that get you up on the leaderboard. I mean, you have to keep chasing, for example, the work hours rather than doing things like actually creating things that you actually enjoy, for example, or helping people through your job, for example. Secondly, there's like the strong bias toward pushing yourself toward getting at the top of the leaderboard rather than doing the things that you actually enjoy in your job. But thirdly, this means that the structure in and of itself enforces people to keep working hard and doing the things that get you that money rather than doing things that are, for example, creative or actually going to help people, because that is what is going to be the metric to determine whether you're successful or not. This necessarily means that people's meaning in their work and people's ability to find genuine meaning in their work is reduced massively when it's just amount of points that you're able to get on a leaderboard rather than actually doing the things that you enjoy or actually like helping other people, which is a value that people are able to gain on our side because you do not just make it about the game and not about the amount of hours that you put in. We have comprehensively proven to you that the source of validation that they prove is minimal. The massive amount of harms of overwork and of loss of genuine meaning is far bigger. Proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech calling the DPM whenever you're ready. Here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes, perfectly audible and visible.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. O has no comparative in this debate. Let's just see, in a world without gamification, can we use O's arguments? First, people work very hard because they want promotions, because you will give the promotion to a particular person who works very hard even without gamification. But two, I think you would give more money to the particular person who actually stays late to the job because you see this particular person is actually doing the most amount of work even without gamification. But three, notice the boss will encourage that particular person, will give a pat on the shoulder to that particular person who works the most hard. But fourth, there's a differential based system in most cases, meaning the amount of work you do determines the amount of money that you get, even in a world without gamification. But fifth, the societal narrative about hustle culture, meaning the society coerces you that this is something that you should actually do, meaning this is something that also exists on opposition. You're likely going to work hard on opposition as well. But sixth, notice we're living in a world with unemployment. People literally go to IITs and still they are unemployed. They're unemployed. This means that the worker population is literally irreplaceable. Notice that the strength of labor unions in the today's world is something that is very weakening. The reason for this is primarily because the entire world recognizes that every particular person is replaceable. This means there is more power for these corporates onto you individuals. Meaning these corporates don't want you because there will always be a next particular person in line for you to actually get that job, because getting job is hard, right? That is the primary reason why people who are actually within that job, it is very difficult for them to actually call out different things and call out these hustle cultures, meaning all their mechanisms literally stand true in their world as well. And therefore this literally is completely out of debate, because there's literally no comparative from opening opposition, because you were not able to prove how all of this changes in your world, meaning the reality of this world that we're living today is that of hustle culture. The question is, where can your interaction in your day-to-day job be better when that is the reality that you actually have to live with? The only delta that comes from opening opposition is nuance, that now some people don't opt into this hustle culture. Now they have an ability. Now everybody person is forced, because now it becomes a norm. I have three responses. First, existence of a policy doesn't guarantee the internalization of the same, meaning at all times I think one particular person can say that sure, like I will work hard, but if I'm not achieving this, I may not work as hard as much, meaning sure it has some benefits of motivation, but I'm unsure to what degree it will affect particular person to literally be irrational, that I will toil with my blood and sweat and will completely get into it. Meaning you do get the benefit, but at the same time, you're not irrational enough to actually actually try to outcommit every particular person at the cost of your personal opinion. But two, Lavanya tells you that rest can be considered as conducive to productivity. Meaning if you want to be productive, you're likely going to see rest as a good thing. Because if you don't rest, you won't be productive. If you won't be productive, you won't get that medal. Because you want that medal and there's something agrees, you're likely going to go for rest. But three, I think that some people really don't care about this, right? I mean, some people will always be like, laugh about it and say, oh, like these are the people who are literally like trying to pander to the boss and trying to get this thing. Oh, they're doing so much hard work. I mean, this is people literally doing college, right? I think in college there are narratives in regards to you giving awards to the particular person who scores the highest. Except there are people like me who always say like, oh, this particular person is studying so much. I studied so much in 12th. I'm not going to study now. I'm just going to enjoy and just going to do debates on weekend. I think such people also exist. I'm unsure to what degree of coercion happens because of this particular thing to actually begin, right? But next, this so people are less likely going to be creative. I mean, like you're literally saying anything. I think if you can be creative and that is something that can outsmart you from the other crowd, I think that can literally be a good incentive for you to actually get it out. Before I'm unsure as to how does creativity go away. One extension before I move on to weighing. First, how is calling out systematic differences within the society improve on Gov? A, given that there is disparity in the world, a lot of people simply reject this disparity to exist. But two, a lot of people think that entry point of women into the workplace solves everything, meaning the situation is solved. This is because they do not see that before entering the amount of opportunities that these women have get as something which is less. Therefore, the skill development has not been the same, has not been at par with male people to begin with. If you are able to see a track record of only male people getting these awards or only cisgendered men getting these awards, meaning you see a track record, you see on the top of ladder, it's always one particular person, it's always just the male people, right? I think you can pinpoint directly that there is something which is problematic. There are three important impacts. First impact, I think you can actually see ingrained biases can be pointed out, because a lot of people say, oh, I'm a feminist, I'm not patriarchal, except they are, because it's something which is ingrained into their mind, because you don't realize that you're a patriarchal person. But two, there's a better colored mechanism, because now it's something distant. Now you can point out that this is something which is problematic. But three, there's likely going to be more progressiveness now, because you have more facts, you have more data for something for you to point out. Weighing is pretty simple. This mechanism doesn't solve the issue of biases, but at the very least, it shows a systematic issue which can be pinpointed to. This is the first step for you to achieve problems, for you to solve problems, because solving problems cannot happen if you don't identify problems. Identification of problem is the first step for you to solve any problem. Meaning, if CG runs an extension about solving problems, we are logical, right? Because we explain our mechanism about identifying problems, and therefore it is something that is very important. Secondly, on the weighing method of realism, right? Realistically speaking, I've explained to you, and Lavanya also explained to you with a lot of analysis, is that hustle culture is likely going to stay. It's very difficult for you to beat hustle culture. Sure, you may have the life flat movement in China, but people realize that money is something that is very important. They're replaceable. If they're actually going to say, oh, we don't care about it, you might have some other particular person replace you. Therefore, we think at a point of when this is the realistic situation that we're living in, the most important thing is that life is shit, right? People don't like waking up and going to job because it's stressful, because it's not enjoyable. You can't change this on opposition. It's the reality. In debates, we like to argue, oh, we will come up with systematic changes. Except realistically speaking, you won't come up with systematic changes. The realistic situation is changing the mindset of people. Because now, even if there is some degree of hustle culture, you have an ability to actually be happy. You have an ability to actually think and be motivated. You are from closing. Shoot.
You can't have your cake and eat it too. Either it is so deeply ingrained in people that it gives them aspirational value and motivation, or it simply isn't, which is why it doesn't lead to people feeling demoralized.
I can have my cake and eat it too, because that's not the bind. The idea is, I think that people have an ability to be motivated, but at the same time, they're not irrational enough to see that they're going to be so deeply entrenched into it. For example, once I saw the Mukmem trophy, I was very motivated to win it the next year. But at the same time, I'm not irrational enough that I literally debate every second of my life, because I like to go to parties too. I think that some degree of equilibrium is actually achievable, and it's actually possible. Meaning, a particular person has an ability to get motivated and has an ability to be rational as well. I think this is literally true. On the weighing metric of proximity, the most proximate impact is in terms of people actually feeling some degree of encouragement, therefore they actually get happy. This mindset is very important, and therefore that is something which actually which is the most proximate and more restrictive, because the day-to-day condition is better. But next, why does the workplace in and of itself get better? Because one, there's a feeling of belongingness, because you feel a part of it. Notice, you can't replace workplace on opposite, because workplace is the reality. Because you're a part of the workplace that is sitting on, you feel a part of it, because now your ideas are heard, because there is validation. It is not not marginal. Validation is something is very important. But two, ideas are more accepted, because ideas are more accepted, meaning generally it's good for the workplace, it's good for the economy, the scale of impacts, But third, there's more happiness. You can share with the family. A father can tell with the child, listen, I won the employee of the month. Maybe a particular who didn't win say, oh, I did not win the employee of the month, but I think I've worked hard. I think now it's time for me to rest. Now it's time for me to work with you. I think people can be motivated. People are rational. Because of all these reasons, vote opening government.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech, calling the deputy leader of opposition whenever you're ready. Here you go.
Can you see me and hear me?
Yep, perfectly audible.
I assume sorry.
Yes, I can see you and hear you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. This opening government team tries to wash everything up, but I think the fundamental flaw of them is that they don't understand what gamification looks like. As the World Health Organization warned last year, game is extremely addictive. Imagine the entirety of your life being about game. You work really hard and get to the top ladder of leaderboard, but the leaderboard gets updated every month, so you have to work hard for the next month as well. Or that you work for more than like 9 hours today, and then you get gold medal today as a form of reward. This is a kind of world that the proposition has to support, not the world where you have additional incentive for work, but rather it is going to replace the existing incentive of work. So things like, for instance, additional payment for additional working hour is now going to be replaced with the gold medals you're going to get in this like kind of like game. And that is a problem that they genuinely did not engage with. I'm going to firstly deal with government's best case, secondly talk about what unique difference gamification creates, and finally respond to opening government's material. 1. Government's best case is that the healthy competition induces more productivity. I have a couple of things to talk about. 1. Productivity is substantially more likely under our side of the house. And the simple reason why is the analysis that NASA gave you as to the collective action problem that this uniquely creates. Because whenever you're competing in a game with your co-workers, you have no incentive to cooperate with your co-worker. So whenever your co-worker asks, how can this problem be solved? Or what's the, do you have this like kind of document that you can have access to? You are going to say no, because you're necessarily competing against your co-workers in the game. So if, your co-worker gets 500 additional points, you're going to lose in the game. So you're not going to cooperate. So this creates a cycle of selfishness among cooperation. And insofar as cooperation between workers is the fundamental basis to which economy of scale increases productivity, I think productivity is substantially smaller on their side. But secondly, I want to point out there's far smaller innovation on their side of the house, because corporations have to be short-termist. Workers have to be short-termist, because you care about what's going to happen to the leaderboard next month rather than caring about long-term stability of the corporation. So for instance, medical companies are not going to invest in a really, really expensive research because the initial investment cost is substantially higher in comparison to, say, things like advertisement, that is going to, these things actually, like for instance, developing a new medicine is actually going to benefit the medical company in an extremely long term. But these things are not going to happen on their side of the house. So in the long run, productivity substantially decreases on their side of the house. But finally, you get more cost consolidation of corporate sector. This is a new material that from DLO. I think you enjoy this. Why is this the case? Because it's always large corporation that is able to invent a new algorithm that is able to be, make this game more addictive. Therefore, it's able to force workers to work harder and harder over time. And if it is true that this game induces more productivity, as opening government says, then presumably it's the case that the larger corporations are always going to take advantage of this, and therefore is able to win on the natural competition order. What this happens is that the more larger corporations are able to absorb on the smaller corporation. What does it mean? 2 things. 1, you substantially reduce the competition in the entire economic market, because this simply means less choices for consumers, higher prices of goods and services. But secondly, you get more bankruptcy of smaller companies. This result into structural unemployment, which is obviously bad alternative. I'm going to talk about firstly the inherent difference of gamification. 5 things. 1, it is zero-sum in nature. They say, well, you get rewards and you get happy as a consequence. But the importance of rewards and how happy you get when you get certain rewards is relative to how rare it is, obviously, because humans are nature of comparison. Secondly, as opening government states and concedes, mentality of competition is going to be created. This is the basic mechanism through which they're able to induce more more productivity. But what does it mean? It means that you're going to feel terrible when you lose this. It means that, your bosses can simply gaslight you by saying that, you know what, you're not, doing really good enough in this, today's or this month's leaderboard. So you have to work more, and this creates a constant pressure for you to work harder. Thirdly, this is a constant visualization of how much you work and how others work. You can always see how others are working or what kind of points that others are getting. Therefore, you have to constantly, vividly compare yourself against other individuals in comparison to outside the house, where you don't have this explicit, vivid image and visualization of how much work you're putting in and how much work the other people are putting in comparison to yours. Fourthly, there's constant pressure to work by your bosses or the financial pressure. So how much points you get in this game is going to translate into how much money you get, how much salary you get. So you're constantly going to fear, what if other people get more points? I might lose some income. That's why I have to work more and more. And that is a constant pressure that you have to be pressured even outside of work. So even when you're at home, you have to check how many points each individual is getting today, because that's how worried you become when you are threatened by the income. Fifthly, government cannot regulate this pretty well. And this is a really important mechanism. This is a black box. This algorithm essentially is not going to be, it's going to probably be different according to each company. Therefore, government have no epistemic capacity to actually regulate all of these mechanisms and all of these algorithms. And what does it mean? It means that when companies that as conceded by opening government that have huge incentive to exploit workers now is able to take advantage of all of the 5 characteristics that I named, and therefore is able to exploit workers even more. And that is the unique delta we provided in this debate. And the 2 actors that we discuss in this debate. First, for people who want to work harder already in the status quo, things like promotion and hard working is probably going to be a huge, reward already. So this is metric on either side of the house. But secondly, I want to point out that even for these people, it is bad, even worse, because of the collective action problem. Because in order for you to get promoted, you have to now, refuse to cooperate with other individuals in the workplace, and that is probably bad. But finally, I want to point out that the work is not just source of income, but it's source of meaning, as we pointed out in NASA's speech. That is to say, if you're a lawyer who is, working on the case of like exoneration cases of like African American individuals who are being falsely convicted, even if he doesn't read to the income, you still feel meaning. But you cannot do these things insofar as the corporation tell you, or you cannot, do this because it result into worse status in the game. Finally, we describe for people who don't work as hard in the status quo, this is the delta we uniquely provided, there are other priorities in life. So think like hobby, like debating, for instance. And what this essentially means is that these people, when they feel pressured constantly by bosses and by the virtue of this game, they substantially become unhappy as a consequence, because you're constantly pressured, and it's mentally damaging experience to have your entire income out of time threatened, and you're not being safe enough. It feels feeling safe enough that your entire income is you can put food on the table tomorrow for your family. All right, finally, let's respond to opening government's material. I think that the basic problem of OG case is that the problem that they identify is never going to be solved because of this gamification, right? They say status quo is really, really terrible. Here are lots of reasons why status quo is not as bad as they say. One, labor regulation by government still exists, which they it's not going to exist on their side. But secondly, competition between companies means that you can always workers can always leverage against companies by saying, I'm going to move on to different companies. DPM asserts getting job is extremely difficult, but hiring new people is extremely difficult too. Right? You have to, there's a huge cost of teaching new people as to what your job is supposed to be. But thirdly, labor union and things like the other form of labor regulation still exist on this debate. Then they say, well, productivity is going to happen. I want to be very clear about the weighing of this debate. Productivity is substantially less important in comparison to our harm of workers, because workers, as opening government concedes, is a far more vulnerable actor. Corporations are far more powerful. So even if corporations get more profits, that is substantially less important to the numerous harm they describe towards workers. For that simple reason, we win the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank the speaker for that speech. Now calling the member of government whenever you're ready.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
All right, you guys in the chat, I'll try taking one from opening up. One sec. Guys. Wait, just give me 1 second. I'm going to set up a timer. All right, considering everyone's ready, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's go. I'll be honest, I don't think opening opposition has a positive counterfactual in terms of how the world gets better in the absence of gamification, because few of the claims are largely abstract in terms of you can create things that you enjoy. I don't know, what are you going to create? And also, secondly, I think helping people, I think you can also collaborate with people like you do, like in games, to be honest. So, I mean, I don't understand why collaborations are not likely to work since group projects and everything still exist. Thirdly, I don't see why you can't get positive benefits pointed, which you do things such as paid vacations and leaves, which a lot of companies incentivize so that the mental health of the workers is essentially better. But I don't also understand why mental health reaches a point of saturation, which is flagged on LO, to this say that it overworks affects your mental health. I mean, you can also get to an extent counselors and individuals who can cater into this pointed, which as a scenario exists, but also saying like when you get rewards out of it, like positive benefits in terms of paid vacations, etc., paid leaves, I'm unsure in terms of then this becomes ever a tipping point for individuals to face burnout. I don't think LO ever proves that. Largely, I think then they talk about why governments like can't regulate. Why is government regulation a good thing on and of itself? And why at the end of the day, I mean, like large corporations would always dominate and ever reach a saturation point, because I think innovation still means that newer companies are still able to break into the market and create unique things. All of that later on. Okay, quickly, what OG doesn't do. I think Robin can't say that we identify a problem and then that's why you're going to be superior to CG. I don't know what do they identify. Also, I don't know what do they solve. Here's what we are going to do then. Firstly, what do we identify? Okay, so I think in the absence of this, and this being incredibly competitive, I think in the absence of gamification, it's largely going to look like that the status that it's going to be defined largely through things like nepotism and bureaucracy. The reason why this is true is because then you don't have a quantifiable objective metric to base in terms of how individuals would likely to get promotions or not, which means point at which when you have greater transparency within the system in terms of, like, say for example, statistics or individuals working hard or like getting certain amount of points for the group projects that they are able to complete, the amount of assignments that you're essentially able to do, the number of new clients that you're able to get, the number of new networking systems that you're able to go ahead and generate, which means in those particular times those are objective quantifiable metrics on which you can base individual success. I think that is important because then the cognitive conceptualization of individuals is largely hinged on the idea that these are the things that are going to lead to essentially promotion. In the absence of this, I think it's largely going to be like individuals not being able to identify in terms of what essentially leads to like upward mobility in the first place, which is those are literal, that's literally the scenario that allows things like nepotism, misogyny to thrive, simply because now there is no ideological counter narrative to push back against in terms of those things to begin with. I think you have greater call out on our side of the house, point at which when you see that in spite of me objectively doing well, getting more amount of clients, I'm still not able to get that promotion, when that is the metric on which the workplace works on. I think that is creates a direct like ability for individuals to call biases out within the system or like call say problematic things within the system. I think that is incredibly important because in the absence of this, that choice never happens. But secondly, I think then it becomes easier for you to change things internally, and I don't think OG has any mech. It like largely comes in like after 6 minutes. So here's why you create cognitive dissonance within the workplace and why this is essentially better. I think nobody is like objectively born, I think, a misogynist, and nobody is like objectively born like discriminatory. I think it's largely societal biases that you essentially conceptualize and you're not able to like have a dissonance towards, or not like essentially have anything to like rally against it. I think point at which when you see other individuals from minority backgrounds or essentially like women doing better like statistically, or essentially able to complete projects, or essentially like say for example being able to rise up the ranks through these objective metrics of gamification, I think at that point of time you have to rationalize your misogyny way more, simply because at that point of time it creates like a cognitive deterrent pushback against you that these individuals are also likely to be as productive as you are, like being a cishet male. I think at that point of time you're way more likely to say for example like rationalize like your biases, and at that point of time you create the cognitive dissonance to flip those biases. I think at that point of time you're much more likely to have a moderation of opinion, and in the absence of this you're not likely to have this because there's no metric on which you can essentially base in terms of how promotions and mobility will work. I don't think opening opposition can say you can create things that you enjoy. I mean, like I don't know how can individuals conceptualize that choice in vacuum to begin with. But secondly, then few people who want promotion, I don't know, like I think that's like a little bit elitist to argue, because I think vast majority of individuals do want promotion and do want to rise up the ranks and essentially want to get upward mobility. I think that's normal human tendency. So they never weigh in terms of why the individuals not wanting promotion and being burdened within the system is even quantitatively higher than the vast majority of individuals who want to rise up the ranks. If that's the case, I think then it's better off with a gamified model in which you're better able to like push back against the biases, have that cognitive dissonance to essentially go ahead and get that change. I think that's the reason why it's way more better at the end. Lastly, I think you're also able to get positive benefits out of it, which OG doesn't say, in terms of like paid vacations, paid leaves, are essentially able to take time off from work when you essentially are able to complete like X or Y number of assignments. This is better able to essentially say that I deserve this because I've done this much amount of work. So that's why proportionally I should be able to reap the benefits out of it. So I think positive benefits that you want to rally in the workplace are also way more likely to happen. That's why the propensity of change is higher on our side. Lastly, like benefits in terms of economy in general, and like largely in terms of like macro benefits. I think you get more amount of research and development and innovations on our side of the house, point at which you go ahead and create an atmosphere of this existing. I think this is why capitalism is good. Like, I think this is because more companies are incentivized to compete with each other. Like, you have more amount of organizations which should innovate more, they essentially come up with new ideas and research, simply because now they're essentially in competing. I think government regulations is bad if like that's opening up. See, countries like Cuba in the first place to begin with, which have insane amount of government regulations that prevents any kind of companies to ever crop up to the market. Okay, before I move on, yeah, go ahead, opening up.
Minorities and women are likely to be unsuccessful on this leaderboard anyway because of the lack of social capital or because of lack of connections. The difference here is that you justify this on the basis of meritocracy because you say that you judge people value.
All right. I get it. The question is, where do you have more amount of positive propensity to push back against? Again, I don't know how does if problems are symmetric, how do you ever generate that propensity? Because you don't have an ideological counter narrative against that in the first place. I think that's what you create through statistics and objective quantification of effort. Because at that point of time, you know, if you put in the effort, you're much more likely to increase in the leaderboard because you're not able to identify that on your side of the house. So I think that's largely uncomparative. Largely, okay. So I think government regulations is bad for multiple reasons, because I think one, that stifles the economy, but also prevents the amount of innovation and research you can get. This is at the end of the day, this creates an atmosphere through which you can have like more amount of research and R&D into the system, which means companies are incentivized to be better. And at that point of time, you're much more likely to be more productive towards the economy, which is you create value positive companies and value positive outcomes in general. I think that is then important, because that means that you have like a better economy. That's literally how countries like South Korea, or say for example other countries in Asia, or like even countries in the Western world, are able to grow, because you create that kind of an atmosphere that pushes individuals to work more, like increasing the per capita GDP. But also this means that you have much better companies creating more to the like the overall economy of the country. For all those reasons, proud to propose.
Cool. I thank the speaker for that speech. Before I call upon the next speaker, can I get like 30 seconds real quick to change my Wi-Fi? Just 30 seconds.
No worries.
Cool. Hi. Can someone speak a little?
Hi.
Yep. Cool. Great. I call upon the member of OP whenever you're ready.
All right. Starting speech in, okay, POIs in the chat. If I haven't taken one by 5:45, unmute yourself, interrupt me, make sure that I take a POI. My preference is for opening government. If you don't have one, CG can ask. Okay. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel data across high schools in the United States of America shows that Caucasian students outperform African American students. You and I, as woke left liberal debaters, know that this is because areas where African Americans go to school are often underfunded, have worse infrastructure, and lesser teachers. We don't think a non-debate version of an average reasonable voter, which is likely to look like the employees within such corporations, is aware of these nuances and structural oppression because they don't talk about it every single weekend. 3 responses then. 1, closing opposition says corporations on their side of the house look like places that give you paid vacations, maternity leaves, and therapists. More realistically, we think corporations look like places with broken coffee machines and alcoholic abusive bosses that get handsy at Christmas parties, right? We think that they never prove to you the likelihood of why these corporations are necessarily going to be better actors on their side of the house, and then have the audacity to ask opening opposition for a counterfactual. We think this is ridiculous because the counterfactual in opposition is quite clearly status quo, because like opening government says, hustle culture was not a result of gamification. However, gamification has made it so much worse, and that's what we're going to prove to you. Two more rebuttals. Secondly, the idea that this data will show you trends of discrimination leading to positive policy change. We think this is unlikely to happen because the data in the leaderboard show how well an employee was able to utilize a particular opportunity and not who got the opportunity in the first place. We think historically and statistically, individuals of privilege are more likely to get such opportunities. Women are deprived of taking outstation trips, not just because of unfair domestic labor that is expected of them, but also because it's significantly more unsafe for them to go ahead and do that. They're less likely to get positions of leadership, which is why we think their scores are inherently likely to be lower. We think the delta quite clearly on our side of the house is government gives you a world where there is objective meritocratic data to prove that women are worse employees, and that makes workplaces significantly worse on their side of the house. Third rebuttal on the ability to rationalize, and we hear this from opening government. I'm glad that DPM likes to party, and that's good for you. However, debating is nothing like having a job. We think it's significantly harder to rationalize yourself when it comes to your employment, A, because of the societal pressure that exists on how everybody must have a job because otherwise you're of no use to society, but also because this is something you simply can't quit like debating, right? Only a bunch of nerds care about debating and the members of pop posting. We think the world and society at large care about whether or not you have a job. We think it's hard for you to go ahead and quit something that literally gives you livelihood, is the ability of that you have to send your kids to college and give your wife a meal. What then is our constructive case? Two pieces of characterization. Firstly, we live in an inherently capitalistic society which constantly pushes you into a rat race, which is an endless run in a marathon that keeps fucking shifting the finishing line. Secondly, gamification as a concept plays on the weaknesses of people. It is a constant urge to seek validation, focusing on short-term gains as opposed to sustainable long-term goals, a perpetual rush to seek instant gratification. After that, what are our arguments? Firstly, why gamification is principally bad? We think gamification was initially created to cause addiction, right? That is why video games are designed in such a way that you want to keep coming back because you're deriving your sense of validation and self-worth from the leaderboard on PUBG, CSGO, or even what number level you're on at Candy Crush. We think this works in two ways. This can lead to a superiority complex, which has its worst manifestation in the incel community as a result of the gamification of video games, or it can lead to an inferiority complex leading to the mental health problems that our opening already talks about. What do we then give to you exclusively? We think the fact that you can't stop and have to go back is principally a violation of agency. In the context of the workplace, this is worse because there exists a double jeopardy. We think employment in and of itself is a result of coercion because society and capitalism force you to go ahead and take up the job in the first place. It's just one of those bucket lists of life, right? Get a degree, get a job, get married, have kids. And that's why it's a problem, because you don't even have a choice when it comes to the opt-in. Gamification makes you want to stick to a workplace for longer, thereby also taking away the opt-out that you initially had. This essentially means that you start deriving your sense of self-worth and validation from the leaderboard that you see in your office every day. We think this is a gross violation of your consent and coercive to the extent that it makes people work more than what is actually good for them. We give you the value of free will because we take opening government at their absolute best, unlike our opening op. Even if these employees are happy as a result of gamification, that happiness is a product of coercion in the first place. We don't think these employees are in a position to be able to differentiate between what is actually good for them versus what a leaderboard will make them feel at the end of the month, and that is why this is a violation of free will. Second argument, practical harms of gamification. One, you're addicted and you can't leave. We think this leads to a disillusionment within employees themselves. They want to work harder at the cost of their own welfare. O already tells you this. What we give you additionally is that because they strain themselves so hard, their mental health begins to suffer, and we think this happens exponentially over time. Because as you're spending more time at your workplace, you're spending less time with your actual support structures, in that your friends and family. We think this is likely to isolate you from the people that actually care about you, as opposed to corporate overlords who only care about money, thereby having a much worse impact, not just on your mental health, but also on your social life. Secondly, visual references and why that's bad. We think human beings are inherently visual creatures, and having visceral depictions makes things a lot more obvious for us. We think this goes ahead and confirms negative notions that individuals already have about their co-workers, right? This largely looks like like a weaker performer within a team, this might be because of, say, personal reasons or their own mental health struggling really bad that particular month, the team is more likely to be vitriolic towards this one particular worker. Why is this true? This is because the entirety of the team now derives their self-worth from this leaderboard, and they feel like they're slipping down lower, particularly because this one person underperformed. We think this creates a toxic workplace wherein even within your teams, you're competing against one another and blaming one person for their mistakes without any sense of empathy. What is your POI opening, Gov?
I mean, I'm okay in being coerced and being happy versus not being able to escape the job in your world, not being coerced. But
I mean, dude,
confident
that's honestly good for you, but you don't have the epistemic access to decide for everybody else, right? We're saying the delta that you have at the top in terms of your best employees being slightly more motivated is significantly smaller a benefit as compared to your worst employees having the worst possible time at their workplace, right? We don't see productivity as an a priori good, which is why you can be happy when you go ahead and say that productivity makes you happy and you're happy to be coerced. We simply don't think that's true for everybody else. Unsure as to why you should dictate the preferences of everybody else. Secondly, then, we think, like I already mentioned in my rebuttal, this goes ahead and confirms the worst biases. Thirdly, and this is absolutely exclusive, why this is bad for the workplace itself. We think when, as I analyzed for you previously, when the workplace itself becomes more toxic and employees start having a worse time while they're working there, they're more likely to go ahead and quit, right? Or complain about their workplace. This looks like going ahead and writing out posts on LinkedIn or even discussing this with your community of friends that you went to college with together. We think this gives corporations at large a worse reputation than what they previously had, increasing their turnover as well as increasing expenses for these corporations themselves. Since closing government is really fond of corporations as a stakeholder, they need to engage with why corporations would be willing to go ahead and take on this extra cost and why that's good for them. Panel, even if gamification works, it makes employees surrender themselves to Stockholm Syndrome, shackling them to their oppressors, losing sight of their dreams, families, and their own well-being and all that matters. Incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Now calling upon the government whip whenever you're ready. Here you go.
Hi, am I clearly audible? Am I clearly audible?
Yes, perfectly audible.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. What does closing government give you in this debate? Three things. Firstly, we tell you that the comparative on the nepotism, and we basically tell you that the major reason for exploitation of workers exists because because arbitrary decisions are made in terms of promotion, in terms of raises, and this is solved by the bringing in statistics into the workplace and basing their worth off of these statistics, which is more better. Secondly, we also tell you that cognitive dissonance to like moderate opinions increases in our paradigm, and thirdly, we give you the macro benefits to the economy in our paradigm. Coming to opening opposition and why there is a inherent flaw in their case. Opening opposition characterizes corporations as wanting to have better productivity, but because of under this very paradigm that they create, there are like two major questions that we need to ask, right? Firstly, why are bosses not likely to disincentivize harmful behavior? And secondly, why is the harm that they tell us, that the constant comparison that they talk about, likely to occur? So under these, firstly, when they talk about how there can be harmful behavior in the workplace, how can there be like things such as trigger warning, sexual harassment that can take place? Why exactly are the bosses not incentivized in this environment when they want so much productivity? Why can't they simply engage? Why are they not likely to engage a punishment mechanism where call out can coexist and where unproductive behavior can be punished and even not even that behavior, even behavior that discourages cooperation can be punished in such a way on the leaderboard that penalizes them in such a way. So because of this, on on a better note, all these behaviors, such as even penalizing that exist, are the help to flip the comparative in our paradigm, where we tell you that because the bosses also need to ensure that harmful behavior does not take place, to ensure productivity and to ensure that their reputation is upheld, they also have an incentive to include punishment mechanisms within the gamification and penalize people who are holding back the work that they're doing. So under gamification, another thing that they talk about, opening opposition talks about, is that people are going to constantly keep working. People are going to keep working into the night. Here's how we tell you that's not likely to happen. Under gamification, benefits and promotions are clearly defined, and the workers are ensured that the labor that they put in is well rewarded. So the workplace literally puts the rule in place itself, so it has an incentive to follow it. The worker does not have to toil endlessly and be exploited without any reward. So on the comparative of exploitation, it's worse on the opposition's paradigm, because they don't ensure rewards for labor, and these rewards depends upon how the boss sees fit, leading to the spread of nepotism, leading to the spread of, say, misogyny, or singling out racial minorities, etc., etc. So coming to the so we solve the problem of arbitrary rewards based on the whims and fancies of the bosses, and in general nepotism, which affects the exploitation of the workers to the most extent in today. The biggest flaw that they try to push here, opening opposition, is that the tables are reset every month, and that this essentially what they do is end up telling us that the bosses hereby want sustained productivity, which is not exactly harm, because we tell you that this allows more workers to put in their best, to have a more equal chance at going ahead and winning at competing every month, to go ahead and win the rewards that are put up for grabs. They don't really tell us why the competition that they talk about as it being toxic is an asymmetric harm, and why it doesn't exist in other workplaces, and why exactly is it so bad. Bosses obviously care about sustained productivity, and because corporations need to ensure that the mental health of the people is maintained, and need to ensure that the productivity of the people is well maintained, and the productivity is reliant on the mental health as well. This is why the companies themselves have a larger incentive to ensure that there are therapists, to ensure that there are better paid vacations, to ensure there is maternal leave, because they want their employees to be at their best, and this they need this to be reflected in their statistics. So because of this very nature of things, cooperatives are more likely to be true to our paradigm, where they do have better therapists, they do have better paid vacations, and they do have better things to cater to their employees. When the closing opposition here talks about agency, it's like in our paradigm, what happens is you can conceptualize how exactly you want to rise up the ranks. You have better transparency. You have better transparency because of the statistics that are put in place and for everyone to see. So here, agency is likely to be preserved, because in the absence of this conceptualization, you do not know how to get promoted. You do not know how to rise up, and you have, because of this less information that exists, you can't exactly conceptualize what actions you need to take. So in fact, agency is more restricted on their paradigm, where they have to constantly keep on working without knowing what exactly you need to do to get a promotion and to be promoted, whereas in our paradigm it is clearly defined because of the nature of gamification itself. So on coming to deal with like opening government here, and why we way out better than them in this debate. So we identify the real problem that plagues workers, that is the exploitation that they face, and the fact that they're not promoted enough for their wages and for the labor that they put in. And this is the key reason for their exploitation. This is something that we identify independent of the opening government. We also tell you that on the weighing of frequency, our benefits, the harms that we state are more scalable and have a more frequent impact. That is, workers are constantly being discriminated against on the basis of their race, on the basis of the gender. All this constantly happens. So our paradigm and our solution that and our problem that we point out directly deals with the problems faced by minorities in workplaces. So because of this, we weigh over opening government. Coming to all the benefits that we give you on a micro level, we tell you that this is better for minorities, better for mental health of the people, who companies now have more of an incentive to protect the mental health. So the long-term burnout that the opening opposition as well as the closing opposition try to argue does not really occur, because short-term gratification exists, and individuals are more likely to prioritize short-term joy, especially when they come from poorer backgrounds, where they come from poorer backgrounds, they don't really have access to that much like monetary raises or something. So they are more likely to be happy enough in their short-term gratification, and the long-term burnout that they argue was contingent on the person prioritizing the long-term gratification over short-term gratification, which they don't really tell us why exactly is that happening. So on that basis, you're more likely to buy our argument that because short-term gratification exists, the idea of long-term burnout is a rare possibility, that the closing opposition brings up. On a macro level, we tell you that the economy is better off because economy is better off due to the research and development that is bring up. There's the net positive income of society because of the environment that this gamification builds, that it leads to productivity. Because of research, innovation, etc., GDP rises, and the rise in GDP ultimately benefits everyone in society as well. We create a cognitive dissonance in which you rationalize the misogyny of the people to make the workplace safer for minorities and for every other people. So because on the basis of these benefits and these benefits that we give you and the harms that we point out within the opposition cases, we believe that closing government deserves to take this debate over all other benches. Thank you so much.
Good. I thank the speaker for that fine speech, calling the opposition whip whenever you're ready.
Yeah, could you confirm if I'm audible?
Yes, perfectly audible.
Okay, right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, no matter how much we need people to work, no one owes their life, free will, and body to others, especially not a corporation. When you engineer out human nature, you create a more oppressive system, a system of slavery to reduce autonomy, and we do not stand for that, right? The reason CEO wins this debate is because side government tells you that we reduce these humans' ability to hate their job, and that is a good thing. CEO responds by saying, oh, you cannot do that. Over responds by saying, oh, you cannot do that, but they don't really prove that, which means we win this debate because we're able to tell you that the fact that you're engineering out the human nature from these individuals in itself is a bad, and that is the only comparative argumentation in this debate, right? I think the problem with Over's case and the entire debate is quite clear, wherein there is no real delta, right? Because opening opposition says things like, we don't want workers to be valued for their work. We don't want their salary to be proportional to the work they put in, and promotion to be based on how much time they slog away, right? Except unless opening opposition is able to prove to you that they have a successful Marxist revolution, or any of the government teams that have a problem with the current promotion system and amount of work people do can prove to you that they have a communist state, we think there is not really much of a delta within this debate, right? Which means, why does CEO uniquely win in this debate, and what do we prove to you? Firstly, on existential dread and losing out on dignified life. No team, especially CG, does not respond to the idea of how pervasive this idea is, right? Because we tell you that in our world, in government's world, individuals and entire identity is based on the work they do. The validation they give you is problematic. Here's how it pans out in the debate. OG says we give these people validation. O says many people won't get this validation. At CO, we win this debate because we proved to you that this validation is inherently bad. What are the reasons we give you for that? We told you because these individuals don't opt into work, it means you need to have a fair opt-out, one in which they have a life beyond that, right? Why does this absolutely not occur inside government's world? Because no, when you create this sense of gamification, every individual seeks more and more of that validation, right? The more validation you get, the more you want it, which means you want to spend more time on work. You want to be the guy who's taking the smallest salary and working 10 hours a day. This creates two harmful impacts. One is the principal impact that member of talked about, that CG was too lazy to respond to, but it also creates a bad impact in terms of people miss out on life in general, right? The fact that they're playing someone else's game as opposed to setting their own meaning of life, what gives them validation, their own leaderboards in terms of what they want to achieve. This is also pervasive because of how much the workspace defines you. Something that again member of characterized that CG did not respond to. The fact that look, when you spend time in your workspace, the more time you spend there because of this gamification, your other life becomes less valuable. It means your work becomes so much more valuable, which means that validation becomes so much more valuable, which means now you want to seek it even more, which means you spend less time with friends and family, which means once again the only identity, the only cool thing about you, the only thing in your life that has meaning is your labor, and you can never get out of this vicious cycle. This is unique to the idea of gamification and not any other structural incentive, for example promotions or for example salary raises, simply because gamification works within the mind the way member opposition talks about you, where it makes you feel like you're the person who needs to, who wants this, as opposed to an external force. Secondly, on minorities and attribution, and this beats CG completely, right? Because no, CG's analysis for why gamification is fair is because no one is born racist. We're born into a system that is racist because of subjective biases, right? The problem here is gamification does not happen in like 4th century AD, where individuals go ahead and build like these amazing algorithms that are absolutely objective. Gamifications happen today. It's made by people who are born into this oppressive and like racist and sexist structure, which means the kind of benefits or kind of things that they value are likely to be that are already same, right? It's the same reason for why in like developing democracies you only have like patriarchal leaders coming to power, simply because objectively we think that we value those things more, because there is no such thing as objectivity. The comparative then is what member opposition tells you, that in their world racism is attributed to something that is objective, something that is true. In their world you underpay women not because it's sexist, you underpay women because they can't work as long, because they might eat maternity leave, because they can't work at nights for their own safety, right? In our world you can challenge those things. You can say that yeah, it's true, but those are also society's problems, therefore you need to fix for it. You need to give free maternity leave, and you need to lose out on productivity for these things. These are unique benefits that come out of subjectivity that we uniquely bring to you. Two things in this debate then. I'll first engage with OG, the team that recognizes that workers are trapped in workspaces and just wants to give them Stockholm syndrome, and then I'll engage with CD, the side with high hopes for corporations, but no analysis for why that's true. Firstly, on OG, they don't give the realistic comparative. They say shit like, oh, corporations will never really learn. Three responses to this. One, there's a more heterogeneity in the workspace in multiple rungs of society, which means it becomes very harder to oppress individuals. The fact that there are more women in power, more black individuals in power, means that the cultural dynamics of workspace has reduced, which means there is less incentive on leaders in of itself to create bad conditions for their workers. Secondly, progressive economies and global pressure on corporations to improve standards with the rise of information and internet means people have an active incentive to go out and like buy ethically and have an option to buy ethically and force corporations to act ethical is something that we have seen is a trend in general. Thirdly, we think that we're moving towards individual ownership, which means people have an opt-out. This directly engages with OG's claim of how IIT engineers aren't working, right? Note there's a rise in VC startups across the world. There are rise in companies that don't have any ownership. For example, Uber is the biggest like ride sharing company, taxi company doesn't own a single car. Weaver doesn't own a single corporation, which means there are more individualistic owners of things, right? Which means individuals have a far more larger opt-out, which means they have more negotiating power, right? But look, if it's against dealing with like OG's like bullshit example of IITs not getting work, they're literally in the middle of the great resignation. For all these reasons, we think workers do have rights and they can have a better job, but only if they believe they want a better job, only if you don't go ahead and reduce their free will or their conceptualization of what they want in life through bullshit like gamification, right? The reason this is a better response and opening opposition response is because at DLO they spent 30 seconds saying, oh, regulations work like and unions work, but already OG proved to you why those things don't work. Only when CEO gives us this analysis of why they do work, we think we win this debate. Before I engage with the idea of like productivity, yeah, go ahead, OG.
Because workplace constitutes most amount of time of your life, why shouldn't it give meaning to you? But two, you never explain why it will exclude you from meaning in other areas.
Firstly, on productivity, right? Look, on your idea of workspace, we think that workspace should not give you meaning if it's not your choice. Which is to say, if in our world, you set the rules of your life, as I want to be a McKinsey employee, as I want to be an IIT, then that's excellent. We don't think your workspace should gamify you into making the workspace your only goal in life. And that's the comparative. Once again, this debate is not about examples as much as all other three teams want to give you. We believe even in our world, some people might want to actually like succeed in their workspace. That's totally up to them. They should set the rules of their game and goals, not some third-party corporations. On this idea of productivity, first, it's quite useless. We think that this is like arguing the rights of slave owners when it comes to abolishing slavery. We don't think productivity matters. Secondly, we beat it anyway because we explained to you that workers in our world are far more interested in what they're doing, and people are opting in as opposed to being gamified into doing something, right? Which means if someone is passionate about engineering, they'll always be a better engineer than someone who's like gamified into doing engineering, and that productivity wins. Lastly, on CG, I think CG has a bizarre extension of how capitalism is good. The problem is when capitalism and meritocratic structures exist, you need regulation to ensure that meritocracy prevails. Which is to say, in our world, it is true that we also want meritocracy, but that can only exist when workers can set their own price. Why is that? Because the value of labor is set like any other commodity in the world, right? Wherein the buyer, which is the company, sets its own price, and the worker, which is a commodity, set their own price. This can only happen freely when both people have absolute free will and agency to recognize the kind of world they live in and to recognize what the value of their labor is, which means we go ahead and regulate this. This beats a bizarre example of Vietnam because we already break big monopolies, right? We break companies when they become large simply because that is in preservation of capitalism and ideas of meritocracy and not like government intervention to reduce it. We think at that point, CG's only extension loses in the debate. We should win quite clearly. Proud to oppose.